There is a quiet responsibility that settles into a person's life when they begin to love others deeply, especially when that love becomes family. Because from that point on, life is no longer only about your own path, your own safety, or your own future, but about the well-being of people whose lives you cannot fully control no matter how much you care. And that realization has a way of humbling you in ways that nothing else can. It does not come all at once, and it does not feel dramatic, but over time it becomes something that stays with you, something that shapes how you think, how you move, and how you carry your thoughts throughout the day. Because your heart is now connected to people whose lives continue even when you are not present to see them. And the more you love them, the more aware you become of how much exists outside of your reach, how many moments unfold without your knowledge, how many decisions happen beyond your influence, and how many situations arise that you cannot predict or fully understand. And this awareness is not always heavy. It does not always feel overwhelming, but it carries a kind of depth with it, a kind of quiet seriousness, because it is tied to something that matters deeply to you, something you cannot simply ignore or set aside. Over time, you begin to notice how this awareness shows up in small ways, in passing thoughts, in quiet pauses, in moments where everything seems normal on the surface. Yet something within you gently reminds you that there is more happening than what you can see, that there are things unfolding that you are not part of, and that your ability to protect, to guide, and to control is not as complete as you might want it to be. And with that awareness comes something else, something quieter, something that does not always speak loudly but remains present in the background, especially in moments of stillness, especially when the distractions of the day fall away and your thoughts are no longer occupied by immediate tasks. It is in those moments that you begin to feel the weight of care more clearly, not as panic, not as fear, but as a steady concern that comes from loving people whose lives you cannot fully carry. And this is where many people begin to struggle without even realizing it, because they try to manage this feeling internally. They try to think through every possibility. They try to anticipate every outcome. And without noticing, they begin to carry more than they were meant to carry. It does not always feel like a burden at first, but over time it becomes something that stays in the mind longer than it should, something that quietly affects how you feel, how you rest, and how you move through your day. Because when you love people deeply, your mind does not stay limited to what is happening right now. It naturally moves forward. It considers possibilities. It imagines outcomes. And sometimes it does this in ways that are subtle but persistent, returning again and again to the same thoughts, the same concerns, the same quiet questions about what could happen, about what might go wrong, about what you would do if something unexpected occurred. And while some of this is natural, while some of this is simply part of caring, it can slowly begin to take space in your peace if it is not placed somewhere else, if it is not released in some way, if it is not entrusted to something greater than your own understanding. Because the truth is, there are limits to what you can control, but there are no limits to how much your mind can imagine. And this is where prayer becomes something essential, not because it changes everything instantly, but because it changes where you place what you are carrying. Prayer becomes the place where you take what is beyond your control and place it into the hands of God, not in a rushed or desperate way, but in a steady and honest way, acknowledging that while your love is real, your control is limited. Because prayer is not about finding the right words. It is not about saying something impressive. It is about trust. It is about bringing what matters most into the presence of God and leaving it there. Even if your emotions have not fully caught up yet, even if your thoughts still try to return to the same concerns, because over time, something begins to shift. When prayer becomes real like that, it begins to change something within you. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, steadily. It begins to create space in your thoughts. It begins to soften the tension you may not have noticed. It begins to remind you that you are not alone in carrying what you care about, and that reminder becomes more important than you realize. Because so much of what creates heaviness in life is not always what is happening externally, but what is being carried internally without being released. And prayer becomes the place where that release happens, where what feels overwhelming becomes lighter. Not because everything is solved, but because it is no longer resting entirely on you. Psalm 91 speaks directly into this place, not with intensity, not with exaggeration, but with a calm and steady assurance that feels grounded and trustworthy. It does not try to convince you emotionally. It simply speaks truth in a way that settles into the heart over time, reminding you that there is a place with God that is not temporary, not distant, but available. A place where His presence becomes a covering, and His nearness becomes a protection that does not depend on your strength. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide under the shadow of the Almighty. And when you slow down enough to sit with those words, you begin to notice that they are not describing something abstract, but something personal, something that can become part of your life and part of the lives of the people you love. There is something very important in that word, dwells, because it speaks of staying, of remaining, of choosing closeness with God, not just in moments of need, but as a way of living, as something steady and ongoing. And when you think about your family, this becomes something deeper than a temporary prayer. It becomes a desire for their lives, that they would not only be protected occasionally, but that they would live in that nearness, where God's presence surrounds them consistently. Because a moment of protection is good, but a life lived near to God carries something deeper, something steadier, something that remains even when circumstances change. A shadow only exists when something is near, and so this image reminds you that God is not distant, not removed, not watching from far away, but present, close enough to cover, close enough to surround, close enough to be trusted even when you cannot see what He is doing. And when you begin to pray this over your family, you are not trying to control their lives. You are placing them in that nearness, asking God to be present in ways that you cannot always be. The psalm continues by calling Him a refuge and a fortress, and these are not dramatic words, but steady ones. Words that speak of stability. Words that speak of something that does not move when everything else does. A refuge is where a person goes when they need safety, and a fortress is something that stands firm regardless of what is happening outside. And when you speak these words, you are not trying to create a feeling. You are choosing to trust something that is already true, something that remains steady even when your circumstances are not. Because life will not always be predictable, and much of what creates uneasiness in the heart is not what is already happening, but what could happen. The unknown, the unseen, the things that your mind tries to fill in without certainty. And this is where trust becomes something real, not because everything becomes clear, but because you are choosing to rely on God even when things are not clear. Surely He will deliver you from hidden dangers, from things that are not always visible or expected. And when you sit with that slowly, without rushing past it, you begin to understand that this is not about ignoring reality. It is about trusting that God's awareness reaches further than yours, that His presence extends into places you cannot go, that His care is not limited in the way your understanding is limited. He will cover you, and under His wings you will find refuge. And that image carries something gentle but strong, something that is not distant, not cold, but close, attentive, protective in a way that is personal, something that surrounds rather than stands far away. And now, without rushing, without forcing anything, you begin to speak. Father, I come before you with a heart that carries both love and concern, knowing that the people you have placed in my life are a gift, and at the same time a responsibility that I cannot fully carry on my own. You see them in ways I cannot. You know their paths in ways I do not, and you are present in moments where I am not. So I bring them before you now, not out of fear, but out of trust. I ask you to place your covering over them, to let them dwell in your presence, not as visitors, but as those who remain near to you, where your protection is constant, where your peace is steady, and where your presence surrounds them even in the ordinary moments of their lives. Be their refuge in moments of uncertainty. Be their strength when they feel weak, and be their peace when the world around them feels overwhelming. Guard them from what is seen and from what is unseen, from situations that are obvious and from those that are hidden. Watch over their steps, guide their decisions, and place your hand upon their lives in ways that bring both protection and direction. Let your presence rest upon them in a way that brings calm to their hearts, that removes unnecessary fear, and that gives them confidence to move forward even when everything is not clear. And even in moments where challenges arise, let them feel your nearness, not as a distant idea, but as something real and steady. Father, I acknowledge that there are limits to what I can do, but there are no limits to what you can do. And so I choose to release what I cannot control into your hands. Teach me to trust you more deeply, not only when things are easy, but especially when I do not have clear answers. Teach me to rest in you, to return to you, to place my thoughts back into your care again and again until they become quiet. Keep my family close to you in their thoughts, in their decisions, in their daily lives. Let your wisdom guide them, let your truth shape them, and let your peace remain with them. Protect their minds from anxiety. Protect their hearts from fear that does not come from you, and protect their lives from harm they cannot foresee. Thank you for your faithfulness, for your presence, and for your care that does not depend on my understanding, but flows from who you are. Thank you that even when I am not watching, you are. Even when I am resting, you are still present. Even when I do not have answers, you remain steady. And as this day continues, I choose to walk in that trust, not because everything is certain, but because you are. And even when I cannot see what is ahead, I will rest in the truth that my family is not unprotected, not forgotten, not alone, but held in your hands. Take a moment now, quietly, and place the people you love into God's care once again, not out of fear, but out of trust.